Hello, everybody. Wait a second. What in the world? Okay, so I'm going to do a presentation on server-side rendering for React. Next.js is a framework that does server-side rendering, so that's why I got their logo up there. And yeah, just a disclaimer, I didn't think there was lots of images in here, so I just put some animal images here and there. So there's like 5 exotic animal images interspaced throughout the presentation. So you can also use that as a kind of a gauge of how far we are in the presentation. Okay, so so I'm going to start by talking about what server-side rendering is, and then I'll talk about how is it different than regular client-side rendering. And then I'll talk about a comparison between both server-side and the client-side. And then I'll show you a bit of a demo of an app I built with server-side rendering using Next.js. And then I'll finish off by just saying whether it's worth using server-side rendering. So, okay, what is server-side rendering? So server-side rendering is when you render your HTML on the server side instead of the client side. So typically for a single-page React application, you send like an empty index.html to your browser, and then your browser loads the JavaScript up, and then creates a virtual DOM, and then it knows what to render as HTML. So it does that all on the client side. Whereas server side, we're kind of booting up a React app on the server. We're determining what to show for your HTML on the server, and then we're sending that built-out HTML page to the client as the first kind of request. And I'll talk a bit about what the advantages are of doing that. Okay, this is the first animal picture. This is a vampire squid. Okay, why use server-side rendering? Well, there's 2 main benefits or reasons why you might want to use server-side rendering, and that one is SEO. So the gold standard of SEO is with server-side rendered apps. That's not to say client-side rendered apps don't get their pages crawled by Google. It's just there's certain delays that happen when you have to rely on search engines to crawl your JavaScript. And not all the search engines out there can crawl your pages as well as Google can. Google isn't the only search engine out there. There's some other ones out there, and yeah, they're not always up to snuff with Google. So the gold standard for SEO is with server-side. And then the other advantage of using server-side rendering is what we call perceived performance. So what I mean by that is you get to see content faster on the server with server-side rendering instead of client-side rendering, where you have to wait a bit longer to actually see content. So those are 2 of the reasons. Here, this is one of the lead developers for Next.js, the server-side rendering framework, and here he mentions how there's a delay in search engines having to crawl your web app if you're using client-side rendering. And well, of course, he's going to be advocating for server-side rendered apps and the benefits of SEO there, but that's just kind of some social proof there. Okay, so client-side rendering versus server-side rendering. I'm going to walk through the kind of the life cycle of an app loading for both client-side, and then I'll walk through how it works for server-side. So, okay, for client-side rendering, the browser first makes a request, right? This is how both mechanisms work. You make a request, you wait for that request, then you get your empty kind of index.html file, which it's not quite empty. It has probably like a little favicon up there in the head, and then a script tag that requests your JavaScript bundle. So then it reads your JavaScript link and says, okay, we need to fetch that JavaScript. So then it goes on and gets that JavaScript, and while it's doing that, you have to wait. Then once you have your JavaScript, then you can load your React app, because the React comes with your JavaScript. So then you have to load your React app, so you have to wait for that to happen. And then finally, after that happens, then your content becomes visible on the screen. And since your JavaScript is also loaded, then you can also interact with your app, do any sort of dynamic actions with your app. And if you have to do any data fetching, then you kick off your data fetching after that. Then you wait, and then once you get new data, you re-render your app. Now for server-side rendering. So the browser does a request again, you wait, and then the response you get, content will be visible to your user because you'll have a HTML file with your layout already rendered out, and so the user will see content there. And then after you get your HTML file, well, there'll also be like a link to your JavaScript bundle. So then you do that request for your JavaScript there. And then you have to wait for that to come back. And then once that comes back, then you load your React app again. So in both cases, you have to load your React app. And then once you load up your React app, then your user can then interact with your app because your JavaScript's there. And then you kick off any API fetches that you need to do, and then you wait, and then once that data comes back, you re-render your app. So that's kind of the walkthrough there. This is a pink fairy armadillo. Next.js is a framework for server-side rendering, and like I said, it's a framework, and it handles a lot of the complexities that come with rendering apps on the server side. So you have to remember on the server side, you don't have typical access to your browser APIs like window.location or your window history to do routing. So Next.js takes care of routing pretty easily for you, super simple to set up. It also does code splitting very easily for you, code splitting by page. It does that pretty much out of the box. And for those that aren't too familiar with code splitting, that means it splits up your JavaScript into different packages. And once the user goes to a page, then it only calls that JavaScript bundle associated with that page. So you're only loading the JavaScript that's required for each page. So that's what code splitting does. It also provides a mechanism to do code splitting by component. So if you want to go one step further for code splitting, you can do it that way. An example there would be if you have an e-commerce site and you have one of those slide out carts, slide out things, and there's often lots of JavaScript associated with that because you have to do be able to add or delete items from your cart with that panel. So you only want to load that JavaScript when you want to render that slide out panel. So if you code split by component, then when the user only requests that component's showing up on your page, then it's going to load that JavaScript for you. So there's lots of performance things you can do thanks to Next.js there. And then, that's kind of basically what I wanted to talk about there for Next.js. Like I said, I mentioned routing is pretty easy. So there's like a pages directory, and then any sort of file that you put in your pages directory, it automatically makes a page available at the file name. So let's say this profile file, that means your page will be accessible at the /profile route. And you can do some customization if you want to change the naming, but this is kind of the out-of-the-box setup that gets you up and running super quick. And then, I'll talk a bit about the drawbacks. Server-side rendering is a bit more complex than client-side rendering. There's a few tweaks and workarounds you have to do. So you might not feel as comfortable on this, doing server-side stuff as client-side. But, and also libraries, not all libraries support server-side rendering. So you're gonna have to take that into account. And some libraries don't explicitly say if they support it or not, so you kind of have to flip a coin to determine whether it's going to work or not. And sometimes support for server-side rendering isn't great, so if you run into a bug with a library, it's not many people might have run into that issue, so support might be a little bit iffy there. So there's that. React came out with some new features like React Lazy and React Suspense, and that's still not available on the server-side rendering yet, although it is on their roadmap. So there's some considerations you have to make there. And when I mentioned the perceived performance, again, that's when I was talking about content is visible to the user faster with server-side rendering. And that might not actually result in better performance overall. Because you see this user interact with app, that pretty much happens around the same time as a client-side rendered app, because you have to still wait for your JavaScript to load. Actually, the initial response, and the very first request response for your app is going to be a bit longer than a client-side app, because you have to remember on the server side, when it's generating that HTML page, it needs to boot up or React on the server, so then it creates a virtual DOM on the server, and then once it has your virtual DOM, then it needs to transform that into a string. It uses actually a method called render to string, and that method is apparently asynchronous, so it's blocking your thread, JavaScript thread, so it's a tad bit slow of a process, so you have to take that into account. So performance might not actually be better, but the perceived performance is always going to be better with server-side rendering. This is a flying lemur. Okay, the example app I built, I'm going to walk you through the stack here, and then I'll show you some videos of some of the cool things that, some of the cool features I added to the app. Okay, so the front end, it's using Next.js, of course, and then data management is being done with Apollo client. An Apollo client is a library that allows you to talk with a GraphQL backend. So that's the front end of the app I'll show you. And then the backend uses, of course, a GraphQL server, and I bootstrapped that with this library called GraphQL Yoga. And then there's actually, so that's one API layer, that's the GraphQL API layer. And then there's another layer of Prisma, which is basically provides you like an interface to do CRUD operations on any sort of database. So you don't need to know any SQL or NoSQL commands. You just interact with the API that Prisma provides you. So I won't go into too much detail there, but anyone has taken the WestBoss Advanced React course, it's the exact same stack. Okay, so, oh yeah, before I do the videos, these are screenshots of the app. So basically the app is like, let's say you're a company and you want to make checklists for your employees to complete, and you want to track their progress. So that's kind of the idea behind the app. So this would be like a user's homepage where they see their assigned checklists. Then this would be like an admin, their dashboard page. Where they see the list of checklists and list of users. There's another page where it shows all the checklists, and then there's another page that shows all the users. So that's some of the pages there. And then, okay, let's go to the videos here. So this first video, I want to demonstrate the code splitting that occurs with Next.js. So I've got the network tab open up, and you'll see as I navigate from one page to the other that we're requesting different JavaScript bundles, and those bundles are specific to each page. So let's play this video there. Okay, so you see I go to this dashboard page, and then you see dashboard.js being loaded up. I go to the checklist page, checklist.js is being loaded up. Then the user page, you see. So all of these JavaScript bundles are code splitted. And then when I go back to those pages, of course I don't load those bundles up again because they're already loaded. And you might be noticing the huge size of 1.1 megabytes, but you got to remember I'm in development mode here. So none of the minification and all those optimizations that happen when you deploy to production have occurred yet. So that's why it's kind of big there. So that's that demo video. Okay, this is I want to show you a cool feature of GraphQL Apollo. So here I want you guys to pay attention to the loading states that happen when you go to one page to the other. You'll notice as I go to one page to the other, you'll see loading spinners occur. And then when I revisit those pages, you'll see it's instantaneous, it loads instantaneously. So let's see there. So this is the initial app load where I'm authenticating as a user. Then I go to one page, loads the content. I go to another page, it's loading the content. So it's actually calling APIs at this point. Boom, it's calling the GraphQL API. Now I'm going to go back to the pages here. I'll go to the home page, and then I'll go to the dashboard page. You see no spinners at all show up. Again, checklist page. So that's because we're using Apollo client, and we're calling the same GraphQL query. And Apollo client has its own cache, it knows what queries you've called previously, and if it sees you're trying to call that same query, it's just going to tap or get the data from the cache instead of calling the API. So that's a really neat feature of Apollo there. And then I think I got one more video here. Oh yeah, I just want to, this isn't really server-side rendering, but it's, again, Apollo and GraphQL. And what's really nice about their development tools here is you can actually do any sort of queries or mutations within their developer tools. So I got the Apollo dev tools open up in the bottom here, and you'll see I can query for whatever data I want here. So initially I'm querying just for all the checklists and the titles for each checklist. But if I want to get the descriptions for every one of those checklists as well, I can query for that, and then it grabs me that from my API. If I want to get the list of users, I can also do that. Notice there's auto completion for all the fields that are available for me, so that's pretty sick. Then if I want to query for the currently authenticated user, I can also do that. So very good debugging experience and developer experience provided by using Apollo and a GraphQL API there. And I think that's the last video. Okay, this is the bat-eared fox. Okay, is server-side rendering worth it? I guess you guys might be thinking, since I did this presentation, that of course I'm going to say it's worth it. There might be some other people that say, well, based off of what he just said in that previous sentence, he's probably going to throw a curveball. And then there's probably some other you that are like, you just answer the question. And so the answer is it really depends. So there's like, I'd say there's three major kind of ways you can have an app. One where your app is mostly static content, in which case I'd use some sort of static site generator like Gatsby or Hugo or Jekyll, because your pages will be crawled very easily, and it's there's no need to do any client-side rendering. Your app will be super snappy as well. Then there's the second kind of category of app you would have is like an app which does require dynamic content, but a lot of your pages are private or require authentication to access those, so you don't really care about SEO in that case. In that case, I just do a client-side rendered app. There's no need to optimize SEO for your app. There's no need to deal with the complexities with server-side rendering there. And then there's a final category of apps where your app is dynamic, but it also has a lot of pages that need to be publicly viewable and publicly available through search engines. And for those cases, you should probably strongly consider using server-side rendering for that. And an example of that would be like an e-commerce site where a lot of your product pages, you want them to be searchable and viewable through search engines. And then you have some pages that are like account pages that can be authenticated. And another example would be like a forum app where most of your stuff you want to be publicly found through search results. There's actually an app, spectrum.chat. This guy, Max Stoiber, he created this. This is like a kind of a forum kind of app where you can join these communities and chat with people in these communities. And this is actually not server-side rendered, but the guy, Max Stoiber, that created this, he did a presentation on his regrets, his technical regrets related to this app, and he said he should have used server-side rendering because it really would have helped with the SEO and the discoverability of the app. Okay, this is a capybara, and that's the last animal picture, and that's the end of my presentation. So if anyone has questions, I can also take those. I'm not an expert at server-side rendering, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, if anyone has questions, I'm all ears.
We have a second microphone for questions. So you mentioned lazy loading, and let's say you have a website that has a lot of images, then server-side rendering will make it quite slow, right? And with lazy loading, you can like only load parts of it. And so is that an argument for client-side rendering? And is there a way to like server-side parts of it and then client-side render other parts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's in the documentation of Next.js, you can, I think they suggest using like some sort of CDN for your images. So your images would be requested by CDN and not rendered on the server. And probably for that reason, it'd take a while to be able to pass your images through a server-side render request. So I'm guessing, yeah, I think using a CDN would be the issue there, or the solution for that there. So yeah, that's another layer of complexity as well. So yeah, got to think of that. Good question.
Other one?
Can server-side rendering be seen as a premature optimization? Say you have like a client-side application that's already built, but you're thinking about moving to SSR. But when do you know when? I guess it applies more to like mobile applications because they're on like different scenarios where they're on like slow 3G connections, bundle size matters, and performance is definitely like a key player. So is it fair to say that SSR can also be some kind of premature optimization?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like if you don't need to use server-side rendering, don't use it. If again, like if you really care about SEO, definitely strongly consider using it. Yeah, you mentioned like the slow 3G networks on mobile devices. Server-side rendering may be quite helpful there because, especially for that initial page render, because you're using your server resources to first build up that initial page of yours. So you're not relying on the resources of your browser for that initial page load. So it could be really advantageous for people with slow connections there. Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult to retrofit a client-side app to a server-side app as well. So obviously, ideally, it'd be best to know from the get-go to use server-side rendering. I think that's why that guy, Max Stoiber, he mentioned that he regretted not doing server-side rendering because now it's going to be very difficult to do. So, yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
Is that all?
Oh, that guy has a question.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for you guys on the first row to get the wire.
So you mentioned that there are some features that are not supported by server-side rendering, like some React features. So let's say in that case, are you still able to use it in a limited fashion, or what are your options? Like, let's say you're already using one of these features.
Yeah, it's basically just, I'm pretty sure it's only like lazy loading and suspense that aren't supported. But I actually wanted to show you guys the code here. I'll show you guys some code here, actually. So this is like the app here. This front-end folder is where all the Next.js lives. And if I go to like a page component here, for example, well, this is a pretty minimal React component here. But if I go to this, let's say this component, you'll see this is, I'm using TypeScript too, so if you're not familiar with that. Oh, it's too small? Okay, wait, let me do the command plus command. Boom. Is that better? Should I hit it again? Okay, I'm going to hit it again. More. Oh my goodness. Okay, wait. Okay. Maybe that's excessive. Okay, that's excessive. Okay, so so yeah, you can see this. What in the heck's going on? It looks different on my screen. Oh, it's because I needed to click. Okay, so yeah, you can see this is just like a regular React component here. Like you're passing in props here. We're I'm using, you can use hooks as well. So hooks are supported. So I'm using a hook here to talk with Apollo. Yeah, this is just regular JavaScript stuff, regular React, and here all your JSX. At the top of my file, I got, well, I guess I don't have style components here. I got style components in this file. Anyways, I'm using style components as well, so you can use style components in your app. Here's a style component for you. But yeah, basically it's basically React. There's just a very few minor tweaks, nothing too crazy really. The only, like, the setup for the style components was a bit custom. Like there's a special document that gets provided by Next.js, and you have to extend that to make your own custom document, and then you have to do a whole bunch of weird stuff that I just copied and pasted from the internet. Yeah, apart from some small nuances like that, it's fairly straightforward React, and the only unsupported features I think are lazy loading and suspense, so should be good.
Thank you.
I don't know, Brian. You're pushing the limit.
With server-side rendering, what's the deal with Redux? How do you implement like state?
Redux?
For example.
Why do you want to use Redux? I'm just kidding. No, you can use Redux if you want.
For instance, like your user logs in. Wait, that's already passed because your site's already loaded, right?
I think you can use Redux.
Like if you have a JWT stored in local storage and you want to visit your site again,
yeah,
that's server-side rendering. How does state get updated server-side?
How does state get updated server? Well, you have this. You just do your check. You can recuperate your cookie value, and then you'd call your authentication endpoint, and then if it passes, then you render your app or whatever. So yeah, it's still doable.
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on, right? Anyone else? No? Okay, thanks everybody.